the ladder of abstraction, the trampoline of abstraction is in my opinion, the greatest tool to be a better communicator. To know how to masterfully use metaphors to jump from specific and concrete, grab an abstract term, bring it down to specificity. That is how we communicate new ideas. That is how we make people feel comfortable when we communicate. Welcome back to Purple Elephant Radio. As I have been doing since the release of my new book, Off With His Head, I'm going to start today's episode off with a poem, one that I think will foreshadow the theme and the topic of the episode quite well. And this one is called Number 27. The bridge creaked from the weight of my feet. I could see the other island. Still hazed from the fog, it was there, in shape, but nothing else. How picturesque to see it from afar. I stood for a long while, paralyzed in admiration. Halfway there, halfway done. I fear I'm getting sleepy in the poppy field. To move any closer, to see any clearer, I would have to push on. Push on, push on. Halfway means nothing if you never make it to the end. So if you have any interest in this book, definitely check the link in the description. I'll be linking the Amazon page as well as an interview I did with my cousin Zach, where we really dive into what's involved in this book. All right, so today's episode is not going to be about the number 27 or bridges or poppy fields, but rather it's going to be about language and the way we use language in our daily life, in our work life, in our creative life. So I'm going to weave this into whether you're a salesperson, whether you are a writer, storyteller, script writer, or just a communicator at your job, this episode is going to relate to a lot of people. Pretty much anyone who communicates on a regular basis. And to start, I want to introduce this idea called the ladder of abstraction. And I have a nice little visual for this. The ladder essentially is an idea that I came across probably maybe 4 years ago. I read about it in a book by Roy Peter Clark called Writing Tools, which I highly recommend. But there was one chapter that introduced this idea of the ladder of abstraction, and it has completely changed the way I write, the way I even communicate doing podcasts like this. So anywhere I communicate in my life, when I learned about this idea, it completely revolutionized my style of communicating. And in some ways, and I'll get to what this is in just a second, in some ways, I knew some of this stuff, but I wasn't applying it. And so let me just get into it. What is the ladder of abstraction? And if you're, more scientific minded, you may have heard this idea. I'm sort of modifying it for specifically writing. So not taking it from a scientific perspective. But at the bottom rung, at the lower rungs of the ladder of abstraction, we have specific and concrete words. Things like, ladder, grass, trees, things that when you hear them, you can often visualize. And it doesn't have to be single words, but we can actually expand that to full sentences or paragraphs. We might say, the kid ran across the gym floor as fast as he could to grab the basketball that had gone astray. So we can visualize it. So that is what I want to get across. Specific and concrete language is at the lower rung of the ladder of abstraction. Then on the upper rungs, we have abstract words, lofty words, things like abstraction. So if you think about the ladder of abstraction, it starts with the specific. The ladder. We can imagine someone putting a ladder next to a tree, climbing up and saving a cat. Abstraction, the visual doesn't really come to my head, and I'm sure it doesn't come to your head either. But we also have words that they don't have to be big vocab words, but stuff like truth, justice, equality. These are also abstract words, even though most of us kind of know what they mean. I mean, maybe if we were pressed, it might be hard to pin down one definition, but those abstract words, they might elicit an emotion, that might create a feeling, sensation in us, either, truth. I love truth. I don't think anyone's going to hate truth, but, if we flip to more negative words like greedy, some people may think, ooh, greedy, get me away from greed. So we can have emotional reactions to abstract words, and specific and concrete words tend not to elicit emotions as easily. Then in the middle rungs, which I intentionally skipped over, we have more of the jargon-heavy intellectual words, stuff that's confusing, stuff that I would actually recommend you avoid as much as possible. These are words like epistemology, ontology, skepticism, empiricism. So sometimes they're scientific, sometimes, jargon in any number of fields. I would say the only time it makes sense to use those words is if you know your audience is only, philosophers, only scientists. Most of the time, you don't want the middle rungs. Because what they do is they create this gray zone where I mentioned before, we have those abstract words like truth, justice, equality. They can elicit a strong emotion in us. And the specific, concrete words, they can elicit a strong visual in our minds. And the middle rungs kind of create that weird, middle ground. Maybe we somewhat have an emotional reaction to them, but we can't really visualize them. The emotion isn't that strong in us. So that's essentially, I think, why we get confused by them easily. But why do I bring this up? Why talk about the ladder of abstraction? Well, my claim, the thing that I want to argue today, is that most people, this is premise one, most people default toward their highest level of vocabulary. So let me say that again. Most people assume that, if I'm college educated, if I read at a college level, then I should talk at a college level. That I should use words that I would use around, PhD students. And I think that premise is false. I think that's the wrong way to look at the world, but I think that's how most people look at it when they have never been presented with the ladder of abstraction. But I want to take that one step further and actually claim that those people, the people who are likely in this middle to upper rung area, where they're not using abstract words that we all know, like truth, justice, equality, but rather using their jargon-heavy intellectual words that maybe the people in their circle know, the people in their profession know, but that the regular person who's talking to them, just having a random conversation, they're going to tune out. They're going to get bored. That those types of, and I'm just calling them PhD students, but you have to understand, I'm talking about just someone who is a relatively smarter person. Those people are least likely to be good communicators, least likely to be creative and to tell creative stories. And that actually, if you tend to communicate in the lower rung of the ladder of abstraction, if you tend to paint visual pictures in people's minds when you talk, when you can really describe a scene, when you tell a story and you can usually engage people, that those are the best communicators. So actually, using the lower rung in the ladder of abstraction is a good thing if you're a storyteller. Even if you do have a big vocabulary, and yeah, you could flex and talk about all your jargon-heavy words as much as you want, but I'm saying jargon does not make you a good communicator. A big vocabulary does not make you a good, engaging communicator. So I'm trying to hammer that home. And the last point that I want to make is that this ladder of abstraction that I just described for you, it is not the same thing as big vocab words. Because you'll see that there is an opportunity to use both the upper rung and the lower rung, both seamlessly in your stories, in your dialogue, in your speeches. It's just that middle rung that we want to avoid, where it's intellectual just because you know the word. And so I actually think, I will totally admit that I think in the Off With His Head book, I kind of did this. I kind of used words that I know that probably most people wouldn't know if they're not reading the stuff that I'm reading, and didn't take the time to describe them or build them into a metaphor. And so I just give you the hint right there. The way that we get and teach abstract language to someone who doesn't know the words is through metaphor and simile. So I know I've thrown a lot at you. Just to simplify and break it down one more time. The ladder of abstraction. At the lowest rungs, we have specific and concrete words. Things like the clouds, the sun, a sunflower. Then the very top rungs, we have abstract words, but people can understand them. Truth, justice, equality. You don't need to be a PhD student to understand certain abstract words. But then the middle rungs, that's where we have the issues and the confusion, where a college-educated person may use a lot of words that end in ism or ology. And because of that, people who don't know those words might get confused or tune out or just get bored. And I'm claiming that when people haven't been taught the ladder of abstraction as a way to effectively, strongly communicate with people that engages an audience, when people don't understand this, they just default towards their highest level of vocabulary. The college-educated person tends to use more abstract language. The high school-educated car mechanic tends to use more specific and concrete language. And I want to make this very clear. The car mechanic is not worse off because they don't know the bigger words. But there arises this arrogance where someone who does know a lot of words, the PhD student, may kind of very subtly look down on the car mechanic. Oh, you don't know this concept, you don't know what postmodernism is. And the car mechanic may have some anger towards the PhD student. Oh, they think they're better than me? Really? Really? So there can be these kind of language barriers, communication strifes, fights that might break out because people are not willing to communicate in a way that their audience understands. But let me just give a specific, concrete example of where this idea of using the ladder of abstraction, where it relates to someone in the business world. Let's take someone like, a financial advisor, someone who's prospecting for new clients. Well, the financial advisor probably has a very rich, intellectual, jargon-heavy vocabulary related to financial terms. They know all the ins and outs of the stock market, all the different meanings of the terms, but their potential client probably doesn't. And they're coming in maybe a little bit nervous, maybe they don't know exactly what to ask about, just a little bit intimidated by knowing that financial advisor has a lot more knowledge than me. I could get taken advantage of. I may not understand what's happening, yada, yada. That financial advisor, they crucially need to understand how to use the lower rungs of the ladder of abstraction, to paint visual pictures, to explain ideas in a way that would make sense to anyone. And so the best way to do that is, I said it earlier, is by using metaphors or similes. And this is an incredibly powerful tool. If you're a speaker, if you're a salesperson, if you are if you're writing even dialogue, this can be very helpful. Essentially, when you're explaining something as a metaphor, what you're doing is you're combining an abstract term with a concrete term. And the example that comes to my head is evil is a spoiled apple, and one spoiled apple can ruin the bunch, or however that saying goes. But what I'm doing is taking evil, which is a very lofty, abstract word, comparing it to an apple, a rotten apple, which most people understand, ooh, gross, I can visualize that. And now we're saying, okay, evil and spoiled apple, kind of the same thing. Now picture in your head a spoiled apple ruining a bunch of good apples. Okay, I can visualize that. Now, remember, change out the words. It's evil. Evil is spoiling the whole bunch. And maybe a spoiled apple is an evil person. And a bunch of apples are just regular people. Oh, now I understand that one evil person can make other people evil, or make other people kind of spoiled, in whatever sense you want to take that. So it was a little bit wordy, but that is what we do when we think of or explain a metaphor, is we're bringing different concepts together. Usually the foundation of that is something everyone understands. We can all visualize it, and we're just subbing in new words or new concepts. And I think that's the best way to teach someone, actually. So this, now that I'm thinking about it, relates really well to teachers as well. If you want to teach a new concept to someone, the best way to do it is first ask, what are their interests? What do they know a lot about? Maybe it's something universal, like sports. You can start to explain these different concepts, whether it's something very complicated, a physics concept, a very advanced marketing concept, and bring it into the world of sports. So I'm not going to go into the details with that, but I'm hoping you can understand how you might use metaphors in that way to make it more effective for your audience to understand what you're talking about when you're bringing in a big, new, scary word. Because that's what language can do. It can intimidate us. And metaphors and similes are the best way to kind of reduce that fear. Oh, I know what apples are. Okay, I can figure out this idea because of the metaphor. And so it's really important, if you are a person like a financial advisor or some type of consultant, you have a lot of knowledge and your client, your customer, does not have that knowledge. The default is that they're going to feel intimidated. And if you want to kind of calm them down, give them a little bit of that understanding, build your big, new, scary concepts into specific ideas they understand. So whether they know a lot about sports and you're bringing in sports metaphors, or maybe their job, maybe they are a car mechanic or a server at a restaurant, bringing those ideas into a world where your customer or client already understands the terms, can already visualize it. But I've said throughout this episode that the middle rungs are what you want to avoid. And so this is something that I'm bringing to the table. I want to alter the ladder of abstraction. And this is going to bring in the second visual of the podcast. So rather than doing a ladder abstraction and thinking about it, again, visually, I'm climbing up to grab the abstract words, and I'm climbing down to get the specific words. I want to view it as the trampoline of abstraction. Now, I really, really like this visual because, again, we still have the same idea. At the bottom, on the ground, the foundation, that is going to be specific stuff we can visualize, we can imagine it. We can imagine a cow eating grass in a big multi-acre farm. But then we have in the clouds, the lofty abstract words. That's the stuff of, power and strength or weakness. We can bring in all these abstractions. And by using the trampoline, we can go up and down very, very easily. And this is what I mentioned with the metaphor. What you're essentially doing is jumping up, your weight comes down, so you're touching the specific and concrete. And then you're going up to the clouds, grabbing an abstract idea, bringing it down. So now it's concrete too, because you're kind of turning an abstract word into an idea we can visualize. So again, I know I already said this. As I'm hearing myself talk, I'm like, Sean, you're talking so abstract. I really am doing my best to create visuals, create more vivid images. But this is something that I'm explaining to you, but I'm still working on it myself. So please keep that in mind. So what I want to do next, I've kind of mentioned how the ladder of abstraction is so good for if you're a salesperson, if you're some type of advisor, consultant, or a teacher, where you have a lot of knowledge, where you're, very abstract, you know all the jargon, but you want the person you're talking to understand you. I've talked about how it's useful for those people. But what about storytellers? And what about people who want creative ideas? They want to act on something, but, maybe their ideas are, every time they've presented something to someone around them, they're like, oh yeah, this is good. And that look on their face says, this person is bored. They're not engaged by my story. What's going on? How do I make something more engaging? I mean, what the heck? I made a very clear, vivid story about, a server at a restaurant. It's all specific and concrete. Why are they not engaged? Well, sometimes as a storyteller, because, when you're describing something, you're defaulting towards specific language because you need to paint the picture, you need to paint the scene. Sometimes we forget to bring in the abstractions, to bring in the words that create emotion. So again, I've been mentioning these words quite a bit. Power, greed, corruption, sin. These are all words that elicit certain emotions in us. And so when we look at these words, or when we hear them, or they're presented to us, they create emotion in the audience. So it creates engagement. It makes stories engaging. It makes us want to learn more. But if we don't have the specific and concrete, it's sort of like we're floating in a cloud. We don't really know where we are. Think of something like a political speech. The crowd's really riled up. They're really excited, but there's no real specific visuals in their mind. Oh yeah, this politician's talking about, getting rid of corruption, getting rid of greed, and creating, blah, blah, blah. But it's hard to visualize. So we need the balance, and sometimes, depending on the situation, we have too much specificity without any abstraction, or too much abstraction without any specificity. So to close off, for storytellers, I'm just going to give you a quick formula for two different scenarios. Scenario one is you don't have any ideas, but you have that urge to create. You've got a camera, you want to make a short film, but about what? You're not sure. So if you're in a film course or a creative writing program, this part will be especially useful to you. So what I recommend is starting at the top. So starting up in the clouds with the abstract terms. And you can jot this down or just think about it. Think about the themes, the words that really elicit a strong emotion in you specifically as the storyteller, as the writer. I'm just going to use greed for this example. Let's say I really hate greed. It really makes me upset when I see a greedy person. And I don't, I'm obsessed with greed, but, I don't like it. Okay, so that elicits a very strong emotion. So now we have that abstract term. But you can't just write a story about greed because it's got to be about something specific. So now we go down, again, I'm using the trampoline, not the ladder. We go down to the specific, concrete, the bottom, the grass. And now I want you to begin thinking about, what do you know a lot about? Specific stuff. What are your hobbies? What's your job? For me, I can talk quite a bit about improv comedy or creating an independent production like this, where I'm setting up equipment and setting up cameras. I can talk about being a server, which was my last job. I'm not an expert yet, but I'm studying real estate. And so that could be something that I talk about in the future. But these are things that you have a strong expertise on. And again, it's not about being abstract. This is where you want to be specific and concrete. So if you're a PhD student and you know a lot about postmodernism, it's not going to cut it. But what might cut it is, okay, I know specifically what it's like to be a graduate student. Do you see the difference there? Because postmodernism, very lofty, abstract ideas. And yes, that person may be an expert, but they're also an expert in the specifics of being at a college campus, studying. Not saying it's the most entertaining stuff, but again, just stuff you specifically know about. So it's not your area of expertise per se, if it's an intellectual area, but the specific actions you know how to do well. Now let's say, okay, I've got that abstract term, greed, and again, this could be any number of terms, but we have greed, and let's say, being a server at a restaurant. So now I have the specifics. I know the intricacies of being a server, a day-to-day type of operation, and I know my abstract word that I want to focus on is greed. So let's combine those together. Maybe it's not a greedy server, maybe it's a greedy kitchen worker, or maybe it's a greedy owner. Maybe they're pushing for more and more and more from the server. Or maybe the server is the greedy one, and they're constantly kind of going behind people's backs and trying to get more tips or taking tables when they're not supposed to. Again, this is not the most entertaining story, but I'm just showing you the process, how to think about this. So from there, we can create a premise. The premise might be greed destroys friendships. And the way I'm getting there is, I'm imagining this story of a server at a restaurant who slowly in the story gets greedier and greedier. And eventually by the end, they have no friends left at the restaurant. In the very end, maybe they get fired or they get in trouble because they've been doing something illegal related to money or greed. So now that I have this kind of plot structured, now I can start the dialogue or the story if it's a script or whatever. And again, even within the story, I can use the ladder of abstraction because I mentioned dialogue quite a bit. This is where it's really important to know, is the character, say, that intellectual type that would resort to the middle and upper rungs of the ladder of abstraction? Or maybe they think they're better than everyone else because, again, I'm just defaulting to these similar terms. They know a lot about philosophy. They know all the jargon words about postmodernism and et cetera, et cetera. Then you're actually, for that person's dialogue, use abstract words. Because I'm not saying it's a good way to communicate, but it might be true to the character. So it's a very important point if you're a storyteller, that for as much as I said, do not use the middle rungs. If your character is very high and mighty, very high class, very intellectual, maybe it makes sense for them to talk like that. And maybe it even makes sense for all your characters to talk like that. Let's say it's a story about a bunch of college professors. Yeah, maybe they are very abstract in their language. This is very important to understand that when we talk about using the ladder of abstraction or the trampoline of abstraction, that we want to focus on being true to the character or being clear to your audience. So whichever makes more sense for the situation. But let's say, you don't even know what themes or abstract words really interest you. But you, again, for whatever reason, in this hypothetical, you still really want to create something. Well, let's try creating a premise or an idea starting at the bottom and going up. So this is where it's really important, if you're a creative, to have watched a lot of great films or read a lot of great books or listened to a lot of great music. Because this is the part where you want to start looking at what you really admire about the works you enjoy and how can you use those qualities, those aspects in your stories. So again, it's not copying a story, but it's taking the elements that you really appreciate and creating it in your own way. So what do I mean? Let's say, again, you're wanting to make a short film, you have no idea what it will be about. So if you happen to be in a film program, I know a lot of my classmates kind of had that thing going on where they're like, okay, I got to make a film, no clue what it's going to be about. So this is for you. Starting at the bottom, when it comes to the specific and concrete, ask yourself, create a list of, your 5 favorite movies, or your 5 favorite books, or whatever the scenario is for your specific craft. Let's take movies. What is your favorite aspect of each of those movies? You're taking those elements and now you're trying to figure out what are the themes, the premises from those works. So again, you're essentially getting your abstract ideas from the specific movies that you love. So I hope I'm making that very, very clear. Now, a movie like, Pulp Fiction, of course it's cliche, but it's a really, really great Tarantino film. If we take that, the thing that I might really, really enjoy from that is the, divine intervention. I think it's the Jules character, where he's supposedly someone shooting at him, but every shot misses. And he's like, I don't want to be an assassin anymore. I really like that one aspect of the film. So then I may create a story based on some, sheer luck type of situation. And again, for the specificity, you do have to resort to what do you know a lot about. I'm not going to tell a story about assassins because I don't know anything about that. I haven't even really read a book about how assassins work. So that's really what you want to think about, is you can use that if you have zero idea, take stuff that you really love artistically, and then extract your themes or premises from those. And then you're still building in the specificity, the concreteness with the stuff you know quite a bit about. But then there's a second scenario, which is more common, I would think, which is where someone is coming in with a half-baked idea. I love to use the Notes app on my phone, and I'll kind of jot story ideas, I'll jot film ideas, podcast ideas, any number of things. But again, they're half-baked. So in those scenarios, what I like to do is, I'll look through that as I'm going back and maybe sitting down to actually work on expanding the idea. I'll ask myself, do I need to distill or develop? So what do I mean by that? I would have to distill the idea if I started with a very specific thing. For example, one thing that I really want to do in the future is create a either play or a short script or something based on college improv comedy, college improv club. I think there are a lot of great stories within that. It's a very specific thing, but I don't have any, abstract ideas. I don't know why it would matter. And I just gave you another hint there. Abstraction, the upper realm, usually explains the meaning behind something. But so I have this basic idea. I want to do something about college improv, but I don't know what. So I would need to distill the idea. Well, what is it that really appeals to me about doing something with college improv? Well, I like that, you kind of joke around quite a bit, but there are some serious elements. Some people take the act of improv comedy very seriously. Some people just see it as, pure fun, and maybe some strifes can break out there. Maybe some fights can break out of, not literal fights, but some people really want to take this and make it a career. Some people are like, I'll enjoy it while I'm in college, and after that, I'm done with comedy. So I like that interplay. I like the strife there. So one might be an abstract idea within that. So maybe I really like the element of envy, of maybe the person who wants to master comedy in this hypothetical story is envious of the people who are very chill about it. Maybe they're actually funnier. They think they're funnier than the person who's taking it very seriously. So there could be a story related to envy involved in the specificity of a college improv club. But then let's say I'm coming in with an idea that is a little bit more abstract. So it's not based on something I really want to write about that's specific, but more likely it's in that middle rung area. So for example, one thing that I want to do is write a sci-fi related story that's related to a government-assisted best friend. So it's like a government-sponsored program where you can apply and get this best friend and yada yada. That's the sci-fi scenario. And you'll notice it's missing the abstract, which would be the theme, the premise, but it's also missing the specificity. I mean, who is getting the best friend? Is it a guy or a girl? Where do they work? What do they do for a living? Where do they live? What part of the country? So in that situation, with that idea, I need to fill in both the bottom rungs and the top rungs. So that's just another situation where you can kind of plot, your half-baked idea on the ladder of abstraction and fill in what's needed. Because it's pretty rare, I would say, for someone to just write down an idea that's purely abstract. Oh, I want to write a movie about greed, but I don't have any clue what's the scenario. That's pretty rare. So more often than not, you're either starting very low on the ladder or in the middle ground, where you have this concept, you're like, yeah, I want to use something that's relates to AI, but it's missing a theme and it's also missing specificity of where is this story taking place? What are the characters like? What do they do for a living? Specific things. So finally, to close this episode off, I just want to remind you of two things. When it comes to using either the ladder of abstraction or what I prefer, the trampoline of abstraction, if you are on the communication side, so if you're a business professional, if you're a blog writer, if you're talking to an audience, a speaker, trying to gain clients as an advisor, consultant, or a podcaster, like what I'm doing here, then you want to talk in a way that your audience will understand. It's a super simple idea, except that a lot of times we think, okay, my audience is really smart, they'll just appreciate the jargon that I'm talking about. Even if you're talking at this very abstract level, make sure to balance it out. Give yourself some specific stories to weave in, some metaphors that create a visual picture in your audience member's head. Then, if you're a storyteller, know your character. So when it comes to stories, a lot of times we're writing characters that, different intelligences, different backgrounds. So if they're a professor, they're going to likely use the middle and upper rungs. If they're, again, I'm just using the same things. If they're a car mechanic, they're going to talk more at the specific and concrete level. And yes, maybe they'll use some specific jargon if they're talking with other car mechanics, but more often than not, that language is going to be more specific and concrete. Even if they're using big words, they can visualize it. So that's really important. Specificity means it can be visualized. There is a sense associated with it. Whereas abstraction does not have that. It's more of an intellectual pursuit. So I know this was quite a bit. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope this episode was extremely valuable. I would honestly say watch it twice because I know I said a lot of stuff there, but the ladder of abstraction, the trampoline of abstraction is in my opinion, the greatest tool to be a better communicator. To know how to masterfully use metaphors to jump from specific and concrete, grab an abstract term, bring it down to specificity. That is how we communicate new ideas. That is how we make people feel comfortable when we communicate. So ultimately, if your audience isn't engaged, then you have failed. It doesn't matter if you're talking big words, if you know a lot of words. If no one tunes in, if people get confused, that's on you. That's a communication problem. It's never on the audience for not understanding. Again, that's always assuming that they are your target audience. Because again, a room full of PhD students, you can probably use just the upper rungs and they'll tune in. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed. I really have felt a new spark with the podcast, and I'm really excited to make more practical, useful episodes for all of you who tune in. If you like this episode, it would mean a hell of a lot if you rated it on Spotify, on iTunes, left a nice review. Thank you.